I do want to thank the Dean and Dr. Webb and Miklos and others for inviting me to Peru. I should say this is my first visit to your country, my first visit to Lima. I arrived around midnight. I've had about 4 or 5 hours sleep, and here I am. And I say that because one of the things I can't do is really say anything particularly specific about Peru at this point in time. What I can do and what I will do is focus on my topic, which is to talk about issues of technology upgrading, diffusion and transfer, focusing particularly on how we build capabilities for innovation in small and medium-sized enterprises. And I will draw from examples that I have worked with in the United States, in the UK, and in other countries. And one of the things, hopefully this is useful, but if you take the view that all learning proceeds by comparison, if we're going to learn, comparing with, whether it be to our neighbours, to other companies, to other countries, it's one of the ways in which we proceed. And perhaps the usefulness of this is if you think about the examples and ideas which I'm talking about from other locations, and then you have to do the translation and bring this back into the Peruvian context and see what's useful issues in different countries. So I'll talk about some program examples and strategies, and then kind of come out by drawing together some insights, and then offering you some questions that you can think about the Peruvian situation. So here's my proposition. Probably not so controversial, but it's good just to put it down. I'll just read it in English. An effective set of innovation support mechanisms for small and medium-sized firms is one of the foundation measures that nations and regions seeking to improve their economic standing need to have in place. So I've already heard, just from the few comments this morning, that you are thinking and you are doing things, and you have appreciated the importance of this. The need to upgrade SMEs is just it's both fundamental. Of course, it's only one element of an innovation strategy. There are other things related to education, to finance, to trust, to governance, etc., regulation, infrastructure. But the small and medium-sized side of this is a really important element. Let me kind of disentangle this. I talked about SMEs, innovation, economic performance measures. Why focus on small and mid-sized enterprises? Well, the exact numbers differ from country to country, but in practically every country, somewhere between 99 to 99.5% of all the companies that exist in that economic system are small and mid-sized. The definitions vary. In the US, 500 or fewer employees. That tends to be a little bit on the bigger side. In the European Union, would be up to about 250. In Japan, 300. But somewhere between 10 to 250 is that really crucial base of SMEs. Now, actually, there are many very small companies, micro companies, which have fewer than 10 employees. And it's also important to develop strategies and support for at least some of them to grow. And if you like, one of the hot topics in business schools is about gazelles, how you can take a small startup company and just grow it very quickly. There are very few of those that tend to be exceptional, Most companies in the 1 to 10 range stay in the 1 to 10 range and may even go out of business. But if they survive, they tend to be small. It's a whole area of thinking about micro-enterprise. But often these very small companies don't always have the capabilities to absorb external assistance. They need more general assistance. So there's a kind of a target group of companies with around 10 to 250 employees. It's a very porous kind of a boundary. Certainly in manufacturing, particularly in export areas, but also in services, and particularly in advanced services. And if you think about how an economic system works today, good manufacturing companies have a lot of services, and services companies usually depend on some manufactured product in order to succeed. So there's a kind of an interrelationship, and it's important that all the sectors in an economy are productive, efficient, and innovative. I put a little thing here, agricultural innovation. Generally in developed countries, the role of agriculture itself is rather small if we think of farming. But if we think of the agri-food sector, it gets often to be quite big. It could be 10% in some European countries or more. In New Zealand, which I've looked at, is probably 30-40%. And New Zealand is a very interesting case. So they're very innovative in agri-innovation, which is that relationship between agriculture and many small companies developing agricultural products, agricultural services, flavors in foods, marketing, selling this stuff all over the world. They have one very big company, but many very small companies. So we think about SMEs in all sectors, and dealing with the challenges of productivity, performance, technology, as well as survival. The focus on SMEs is important. If we think of some of the success cases in maybe over the last 50 years, think of Japan. Now, when you think of Japan, you usually think big companies, Toshiba, Panasonic, Matsushita, Nippon Steel. It's actually a very interesting discussion and argument that the real success and strength of the Japanese economy is around the growth of small and medium-sized enterprises. They actually have, although it's a smaller economy than the US, twice as many SMEs, and many of their SMEs are very capable, have high levels of technology, and they feed into the success of the big companies. If you understand something like the Toyota method of production, Toyota actually makes only a very small part of the car. They depend on very large numbers of suppliers and sub-suppliers, small companies who are very competent to feed into that process. The success of Japan arguably has depended very greatly on SMEs. The growth of Taiwan has depended on SMEs. The growth of regions such as Baden-Württemberg in Germany has, in the last 50 years, has grown from a poor agricultural area to a very technology-intensive area on SMEs. In Emilia-Romagna in Italy, the creative companies in London. And as we look around the world, you can see over a period of time with sustained effort that the growth of small companies, their networking, their engagement, some of them grow to big companies, but there's still a strong cluster of small companies, is very important. Innovation, maybe I think this was mentioned by Professor Webb. There's more to innovation than just science, and there's more to innovation than product. It's also about improving processes, it's about improving services, it's about upgrading the business model, the way in which a company works. It's about upgrading relationships. So there's a whole package, a mix of things that relate to innovation. And often this is about taking things which are already known, they're not new to the market, but they're new to the firm, very helpful to the firm, bringing them in, having those absorbed and learned by the firm, and the firm steadily tries to improve its performance. In some cases, they are new to the market, but in most cases, they're new to the firm. Because this puts universities in very interesting positions, because universities, if they're research universities, like to be on the leading edge. Very good in working with a small number of high-tech startup companies. But in terms of the mass of ordinary, regular SMEs, universities often struggle to find ways to connect with those companies, because it's not dealing per se with entirely new knowledge. It's only new to the clients and to the customers, but not necessarily new to the people that are trying to transfer this knowledge. The thing here is that innovation is a set of things. They should be interrelated, and we have to think of the ways in which we can diagnose particular companies' needs, sectors' needs, and work out what the opportunities are for them to improve. Economic standing. How should we measure the results? What's the purpose of this? I think it is about improving value added and living standards. I mean, if at the end of the day, all our efforts to improve companies are not improving wages, living standards, the quality of life in our communities, well, I don't think we've quite got to the picture. And this is also quite an interesting challenge. I remember working in South Africa with small companies, and those companies before or during the apartheid period were often very unequal. The owners earned a lot of money, and the ordinary workers didn't get very much. So one of the challenges in the new South Africa is to try and reformulate those SMEs so there's a much more equitable set of relationships within the companies. And overall, they kind of perform, I think, probably much better in that way. I should say that in today's world, though, it's not all about value added and profit. We have to think about issues of equity, as I just suggested. Resilience, fostering SMEs gives diversity. To an economy of 1 or 2 small companies collapse and you've got 1,000, it's not a big deal from the view of the whole economy. It may be for those individual firms. If you depend on a few very big companies, and those big companies decide you're no longer a favored location, that can be very devastating for a community. So promoting SMEs is very important for economic resilience. There are also issues about sustainability in working with SMEs as well as with other companies and institutions to be more mindful of the way in which we use resources so that we can produce, if you like, more things, but with less resources. That's also one of the challenges for innovation. As I mentioned, thinking about working with SMEs, upgrading them technologically is a foundation measure. You cannot be an effective innovation system or an economic system unless you're doing this. But there also need to be other things in the mix. Working with education, working with science and technology, working with big companies, foreign investment, trade, etc. You name it. And so you have this has to be worked in to the broader package. It also seems to work best where there's a broad societal understanding of the importance of innovation and trust and good relationships between the different actors in the system. There are roles here for nations, but also particularly for regions and for local institutions to work. Local institutions can work with their local SMEs. Nations can help make those services work much more effectively. Well, some of the barriers, why are we focusing on this? And there are many, and I'd be surprised if these didn't all apply to the case of small companies in Peru. So I won't belabor them. But there are many constraints. There are constraints of finance, accessing finance. There are constraints in the financial system, which is when a small company wants to go to a banker and says, I want to reorganize my workflow process into a new kind of a cell, and the bankers don't understand that. And they can't understand the benefits that would be achieved from that. So there are issues in finance, in the broader financial system. There are issues of know-how. Small companies have fewer people. The managers, the owners are generally focused on immediate things, keeping the business going. They may have learned their trade. Maybe it's an electrical machinery company, but now everything's being done by software. But they're not familiar with software technologies. So as technology changes, know-how can become obsolete. So the issues of know-how, of skills, of the ability to access markets, of relationships. Often SMEs, I don't know if this will translate very well into Spanish, have a yin and yang kind of a relationship with other companies. On the one hand, they sometimes like to work with other companies. On the other hand, they're very independent, want to keep things to themselves. We found in looking at companies in the state of Georgia, where we do studies and surveys quite extensively, in my role as a professor at Georgia Tech, that those small companies that work with, have relationships with other SMEs and with larger businesses tend to be more productive and innovative. Those companies which are very isolated, try and keep things to themselves, see the competition as the company across the street, don't want to work with them, tend to perform less well in terms of productivity and profitability. So breaking down this and encouraging SMEs to work with other companies, to work with universities, is a challenge. Companies also, of course, have issues of regulation. One of the first things that usually happens when you talk to an owner in a small company is they're complaining about the taxes, the government, the workers' compensation, the new environmental laws, the labor laws, etc. This is standard all across the world. One of the things, the ways I think positively about this is companies can often innovate their way around regulation. If they have some pollution problem, for example, which they thought is going to cost them a large amount of money to address, by working with innovation support services, they may find a completely different way, which they weren't aware of, to address that problem at much lower cost. So I think we're always perhaps going to have regulation that needs to be addressed, but innovation support can help enable companies to kind of navigate, to be good citizens, but also to improve their own productivity and performance. Finally, an important constraint is about strategy. SMEs tend to be rather focused on the immediate, next week's delivery, how I'm going to meet the payroll, how I'm going to get this order done, and things like this. It's often hard for them to find the time because the owners are doing so many different jobs to sit back and think and strategize about the long-term prospects and growth capabilities of the company. So these are all some of the constraints to innovation. Now, I've been talking about upgrading services, innovation services. These are sometimes known as technology extension services, industrial extension, real services. So there's a number of different names for this kind of an activity in different countries. But they're essentially doing or targeting a similar challenge. What they're trying to do is provide expert guidance, brokerage, outreach, particularly going out into the field and working one-on-one or one with many with companies to try and stimulate them to improve their use of technology, their productivity, their competitiveness. Now, stimulate is the right word. You cannot force an SME, not in this kind of a scheme, to do anything. All you can do really is give them some ideas, you can give them some incentives, you can give them some encouragement, you can give them support. So it's very much a kind of a relational kind of an activity. It's often challenging for experts because what you have to do is to find experts in the system who are both competent technically, have good business understanding, and can get on with people and work with people. And often that's a kind of a hard combination to find and to do this. So finding the people is a challenge. I'll kind of come back to this. But the idea is essentially to broker, to stimulate, to encourage, to catalyze companies to think about and to act upon opportunities to improve their position. And the mechanisms can be by providing information, by benchmarking. Now benchmarking is really interesting because when you benchmark anyone, everybody thinks they're above average, because it's not technically possible for everyone to be above average. But if you interview managers and ask them about their performance, their company, they always think that they're above average and they're doing well. By benchmarking and showing them some objective measures of how they perform against other similar companies or leading companies, the two ways of doing this can be very eye-opening. And the small companies can realize where they might be strong, but also where they're weak, and then that creates an opportunity for dialogue about strategies to improve the company. So benchmarking, technical assistance or consultancy, the training, and this is not only the training of workers on the shop floor or in the office or driving the trucks. This is also about the training of the middle managers and of the seniors to help them understand opportunities and needed skills in their field. Other mechanisms are working with groups, with networks, with clusters, with collaborative projects, which could be around R&D, could be around implementation, and very importantly, working on strategy development, coaching and mentoring. Recently, about a year ago, we completed a study for the National Institute for Standards and Technology in the United States about something called the Eureka Winning Ways program. If you look on my website, you can download reports that we did for this. But what was this program? It was essentially working intensively with small and mid-sized companies, some expert outside consultants, understanding that company, trying to work through the growth opportunities, but then a very intensive mentoring set of activities. Now this is quite interesting. This program is sponsored by a technology agency, a very advanced technology agency in many respects. But the way in which they're trying to help SMEs in the US to innovate and upgrade in this particular case isn't about technology, it's about strategy development, it's about coaching, it's about helping companies develop implementation plans. When I was involved in the evaluation of this, I was initially skeptical because it seemed, how would this work? But as we went into it, as we talked to the companies, as we looked at results, as we did the controls, there actually was a definite value added from this kind of intensive, strategic and mentoring engagement with companies. And of course, the companies themselves, have to be willing to engage in this and willing to open up, willing to change. This can come if the company feels it's in a crisis. If I don't do something, we're going to be out of business next year. It can come when there's a management change, when older people move away and younger people come in. Or it can come when they look at their competitors and gradually realize, we need to do something a bit different in this company if we're going to grow it or survive. So understanding why companies engage and encouraging that is also an important element. Since there may be public policy people in the room, I have a hat. I'm a professor in a business school. I'm also a professor in a public policy school. And public policy analysts, of course by economics, they want to know why. What's the case for this? Particularly if we're going to be using some public funds, why should we be subsidizing activities which private firms and private consultants should be doing anyway? And if they don't do it, that's their own fault. That's how the market works. What's the rationale for government and for public institutions for thinking about this? Well, I think there are several. The first is the classic market failure argument. And here we have market failures on the demand side, as I've discussed. Small companies typically lack information and knowledge and resources to implement strategies and methods that could improve their productivity, their export performance, and other aspects. At the same time, we have supply side problems. On the supply side, we have large customers who often are very aggressive towards their small suppliers. They just want the cheapest and don't give the small company any room to maneuver, to get some resources to invest. We have vendors who will just sell you what they have on hand. So if you think you've got too much inventory, you can easily find a vendor who will sell you a new computer system to manage that inventory. But perhaps what you really needed was to have a different method of production and a different business model, so you don't have the inventory in the first place. So vendors typically sell a specific set of products. We have consultants who find it very difficult to work with SMEs. It's just that there are high transaction costs. It's not greatly rewarding. We have universities that are much more interested in a few glamorous high-tech startups, not working with, if you like, regular, ordinary SMEs. So there are these supply-side issues. So the market failure argument is we could leave it like this, but the problem is, because of these demand-side and supply-side issues, the whole economy will be working at a suboptimal level. There's not enough investment being made in these companies. They're not making the right choices, or they could be making better choices. We're losing a lot of opportunities. So the market failure argument is a very strong argument for this. There's also, if you like, a government failure argument. This is the flip side of the market failure argument. Again, governments like to do politically popular and highly visible things. I'm sure it's completely different in Peru. I'm not talking from any experience in your system. The problem with working with SMEs is it's a completely unglamorous activity. You don't get to cut any buildings. You're just working with a large number of small firms. There are usually no big hits, and it's a long-term process. And when you kind of couple this together, you can see why it often doesn't become high on the agenda of government decision-making. One of the strategies in terms of thinking about this is often it could be good to move the responsibilities for working with SMEs outside of the government, to give it to non-profit organizations, potentially to universities, if those universities have capability, and government agencies can ensure accountability, but don't set priorities for specific activities. A third rationale for working with SMEs is for local economic development. It could well be, and perhaps Peru is one of these countries where you have a very powerful capital, but there are many other places in the country that are hungry for economic development, and working with the SMEs is one of the ways to try and gradually move themselves forward. That may also be the case in a large metropolitan capital too, where there are certain areas where this can work. So it's not all about working just with big companies, but working with SMEs. And if we don't do this, we may end up with an uneven distribution of economic activity and not really doing too much to change that. And finally, there are strategic concerns. If we want to maintain jobs, if not grow jobs, but live in a free market world, then working with SMEs for innovation is really a strategic and crucial thing. Countries, I think, and I think this is true for much of Latin America, you can no longer be a low-wage economy. I don't think anyone ever wants to do that, because in Asia you have countries which are, if not lower wage, also very efficient. So, of course, you could have trade protections and other things to try and fence yourself off. I don't think there's a strong history of that. But if a country is going to try and find its way in a world of open markets, then it needs very competitive firms, and providing upgrading services to make some of those firms more competitive is really crucial, because that relates to expanding exports. It also relates to supply chains. If you want to attract large companies to come to your region, it's a lot easier if you have a large number of very capable SMEs that they can work with, and that becomes a more attractive proposition to them. Let me just skip on and say what this upgrading activity is not. So it's not just about technology transfer from labs to firms. It's not just about advanced technology, but it's about pragmatically working with SMEs in their operations and practices, and usually with commercially proven technologies. These are procedures, solutions, software systems, machines, models, ways of training that we already know about somewhere in the system, but we're just applying them to a new set of companies. So being very pragmatic. And unless you do that, unless you kind of get the existing operation of an SME working well, then there's no possibility that they can absorb more sophisticated strategies and technologies. It's not a short-term jobs program. I think I've mentioned this. The results, you have to think of a decade or two in order to fully embrace this kind of an activity. The results take time to materialize. They take sustained efforts, and there may be some cases where you do lose jobs in particular companies. If you improve productivity in a company, they can produce the same with fewer resources, and it makes them more efficient. There may be some cost in terms of jobs, although usually those kinds of companies then demand more services. They may grow, and so the jobs will kind of come out in other ways. But I don't think we should ever promise technology upgrading, innovation, services as a jobs creation program. It's all about competitiveness, productivity, and performance over the long term, which should feed back into higher wages and higher jobs, but certainly not in the short term. We shouldn't think of this as just a government program. It has to be processes driven by industry and company needs and market opportunities. So it can't just be push. It has to stimulate the appetite. It has to catalyze. It has to encourage, has to be responsive to company needs. Innovation service is not a resolution to crisis or radical economic transition. For these services to work, I think you need a reasonably stable economic base. If we've got, deep slump in the manufacturing sector or other sectors as we had in a year or two ago, this kind of program doesn't. It's not an immediate solution to that. But what you can do is during downturns take opportunities to improve capabilities in companies, so when the upturn comes, they're more able to take advantage of it.